This is Cults and the Culting of America podcast. My name is Scot Loyd, along with my friend Daniella. And Daniella, it's been a minute since we've had the opportunity to record, coming back after the holidays, but good to see you in the bright orange. And the knitting cult lady is still here and thriving in 2025.
Well, Scott, 2025 started off with a literal bang as lightning hit the Capitol building, the Washington Monument, the One World Trade Center, and the Empire State Building. And so it's just like, welcome to 2025. None of us know what's going to happen. However, we have a guest today who's very exciting because she has lived through a lot of this kind of stuff before, and she knows exactly what's going on. And we are going to let the amazing New York Times bestselling author, Tia Levings, introduce herself.
Yes. So I am the author of A Well-Trained Wife, My Escape from Christian Patriarchy. It came out in August, did debut on the New York Times list. It's also an Audible Canada Best of Year, which I'm super stoked about because I read my own audiobook, and that was a massive accomplishment for a cult survivor to tell it in my own voice, as you well know, Daniella. So my work spotlights the realities of Christian fundamentalism and the American theocracy, the world that we're living in now. It's all got evangelical patriarchal roots, and that's what my work draws the parallels so that people can understand the root sources that are in our entertainment, politics, news headlines, even faith deconstruction and trauma recovery are all touched by a patriarchal system that's deeply embedded into our relationships and culture and world. So I have a never-ending trove of material. It's always there.
Welcome, Tia. We're thrilled to have you. And I was watching some of your content today, and it was just amazing. Your story, and then your best-selling book. And I just wonder, how long did it take you to find the courage to tell your story? Was that something that you knew immediately? This is something that I want to share, or did that develop over time?
Yeah, great question. No, it evolved because my book, even though I had always wanted to write and did write in some capacity, my book started as therapeutic journals that my therapist recommended I start because I was doing so much work in therapy and I needed help seeing my experiences externalized on the page. I was having a hard time stepping outside of them. And so when you write what happened to you down, you're able to see a sequence of before and after, sequence of events, who are the players, what are the more external influences. So it was really beneficial. And then it formed into a timeline and a narrative. So there was a day when my therapist was like, I think you have a book here. And that was probably 2 drafts in. Over the next 10 years, that book would become first a novel, then a memoir told with a pseudonym. And then finally, I was ready to tell it in my own voice with my own name and sell it on the large stage. So it sold on the 13th draft in 2022, and it came out last August.
It's such an amazing book. I love the way Scott asked the question, how long did it take you? Because I think what's so different about your book is that you had done so much of the deconstruction and of the healing. And that's a little more rare in the realm of cult survivor books.
Yeah.
What do you think is like the amount of time, like the minimum amount of time people should wait before doing what you've done?
It's hard to put a number on it because what you need to be able to do is tell your story without re-traumatizing yourself. And that's different and individual for everyone. I am very suspicious if it doesn't take years because there's so many layers that has to happen. I will say there's been some dramatic growth that's parallel to my story that I use every day. So for example, I had a lot of vocal work to do. I was using Fundy Baby voice as a fundamentalist. I had to retrain myself to speak in my own voice, but I also had a stuttering problem from trauma and anxiety and things. And so I had to work all of that in tandem with my trauma recovery. And when I told the story, I worked with a trauma writing coach, Lisa Ellison, and she really helped me make sure my story was cooked before I put it out there. That was her term for you're able to withstand some constructive criticism. You're able to be impervious to people who just, they're going to say stupid stuff about your story. And you're able to tell it in many different forms without, re-traumatizing yourself. So, that took years. All of that took years. And then I've grown since I started talking too. Like you evolve as you tell this. So over the last 3 years, I'm definitely a better communicator and storyteller than I was when I just even started the public facing part of this process.
Yeah, I found that to be so interesting. I mean, I keep saying that writing a book deconstruction is like a whole different level because you can't stay shallow, right? You have to
Right.
go to these deep, dark places. And you do that really beautifully. Another thing that I think is so important about your book is that you are showing the regular, everyday extremism that's like
Mm-hmm.
hiding in plain sight. And I think you once mentioned that your initial title was an American Burqa.
Yeah.
And you're very much trying to make this parallel, and as you know this, I start my cult book club with my book, which
Mm-hmm.
is very intense, from one of the world's recognized extreme cults. And then we
Mm-hmm.
wrap up with your book. And I think of these as almost like two different ends of the spectrum of like, people expect my story to be so extreme. But then when I was digging into your story, it's like, I just kept thinking, and there are families like this in every church in America,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. I grew up, my story starts in a Southern Baptist megachurch with 20,000 members. And it's really important to me that I start there because my process was groomed into me through childhood. I didn't just wake up one day and join a cult. There was a decision-making process that had been formed, and my church formed it. So that same church is now at the heart of Christian nationalism and the movements that we're seeing now. So I call it the cult without walls because it is in every home. It is infiltrated and saturated into our culture. And my mentors, some of my mentors were in the same group that the Duggars were, and they were on TV, TLC, it's very mainstream.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness, Tia. So I leave the Children of God when I'm 15, and I have
Mhm.
been completely isolated on a commune, no media up until this point. And I come out and the Duggars are on television. And I
Right?
literally remember being like, America's just watching a cult.
I know. It must have seemed so upside down to you. Because I had the same like fear in my heart, like, are they really going to show what this is like? Are they really going to like, there's cameras in their home. How are they
Yeah.
going to not?
Well, and also, just meeting so many people with backgrounds like yours who
Hmm.
would say to me, oh, I can't fathom your life. But meanwhile, I'm like, oh, but I recognize this in your experience and this in your experience. And I have said for a while that I think that some of the extreme evangelicals and Mormons, like, they want to be where the Children of God is, with the control and the ability to, do what they want.
Yeah.
Tia, something that we talk a lot about on this podcast is something you alluded to when you introduced yourself, and that's the way that patriarchy, high control religion. If you pull that string, it's connected to so many things in our culture, and thus, Daniela is writing about the culting of America, and it's really hard to escape sometimes because it's everywhere you look, and everywhere
Hmm.
that you go. So, what are some of the things that you have noticed on this side of your experience? And when did you come to the realization that hey, it's more than just my experience, because it's happening everywhere in almost every sector of the United States, for sure.
Yeah. So one of the things I say often is that how the Christian patriarchy runs their homes is how they want to run the country. And they're very open, commonly shared, preached every Sunday strategy for dominion And that's what it is, dominion theology, that teaches that Christians have a mandate from God to take over the globe, basically. They're going to start with America. And they preach this all the time, and people just kind of like take it, with a grain of salt, but there's an actual strategy and marching order in place. And it can be hard to like listen to all that and then think that it's going to translate to a culture that, for example, knows what it's like to have educated women and knows what it's like to have women in the workplace and birth control and contraception and, like things that we can do to be a modern society. How do you put that all back into a box and put it back into this Christian crusade? So they are, gearing up for this culture war, and they use that kind of terminology all the time. We're at a war with the world. The world is not for you. Be in the world, but not of the world. And so the Christian mindset and worldview is very narrow in that direction. Knowing this, I, had my experience and my escape and then my trauma therapy. And as I said earlier, I was writing my story and the things that had happened to me. And then the 2016 election came, and I realized that everything I had worked so hard to escape was behind Donald Trump. Like he's this front guy, this shiny, like Antichrist type figure, but behind him is the Heritage Foundation and the Project 2025 people and all those names and faces, Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and these deep, deep, deep pastors that are in the same tradition as this evangelical patriarchy that's been there all along, very patiently marching towards Washington, and they're there. And so that's when I knew like there was this parallel of like, oh, I have to tell this story because it's not just about me. And I need to tell my fellow American women like what it's like to live in this world. But it's still taking me by surprise. The tradwife movement, which is just the same old thing we were doing before. It's just hit critical mass and it's on social media.
Right.
Plus what's happening with Project 2025 and the fact that he was reelected after everything that happened. It is here. We are facing Christian nationalist theocracy, and that is what it's like to live in those homes. We know all we have to do is amplify the practices that are done in those homes to know what they're doing to our laws one by one, and what they're trying to entice us with through their pretty and very attractive social media.
So Tia, can you tell us why it seems so attractive? Like, why does the tradwife thing seem so attractive? Why does what to so many of us looks like steps backward? Like,
right.
What do you think that is?
Yeah, I think, and you've heard me say this before, we've talked about it with cults. The fundamentalists, like fundamentalism in general, no matter what religion it belongs to, even if it's a non-spiritual religion, that approach where you have an ideological purity, you have a soothing outcome, a promise, and a very clear formula of steps that if you do them right and you do them in sequence, you will definitely achieve this promise. That's very attractive to chaotic societies, people who are disorganized, people who desperately want the same things that we all want. We want happy marriages, secure relationships, children that turn out right. We want a thriving society and a good economy and all of these things. And so one of the things I also say a lot is that the patriarchy has a way of creating the situation and then offering the solution. So they have created a chaotic world where we don't have social safety nets, where they have voted against our ability to have a more balanced society with better, stronger democracy and rights for women. There's no Equal Rights Amendment, for example. They vote against all of that. Then chaos ensues. Backbreaking labor ensues. We're all exhausted and tired and looking for a solution. And then they swoop in with that solution and say, you just need to go back in time. We just need women to go back home. Wouldn't it be easier at home? Here's a bread recipe. Here's a lot of babies. Aren't the babies pretty? Let's just live this simple life at home. And we know what it's like to be Puritans and 1950s housewives, but all that evidence just fades because they've shamed science. The whole Make America Healthy movement again has shamed science, shamed any kind of testimonial that we might fall on, and we fall into the lull. Ballerina Farm is very hypnotic and soothing, and lots of people will say, oh, I just watch it for the entertainment. But yeah, that's why it's as hypnotic as it is. You're just drawn in.
And it's interesting to me is that so many people assume, right, that by going back that it's going to make things better. And when the men who look like me, especially, say those kinds of things, that should be indication number one that it was better for them. Is better for people that look like me and not everyone else. It's like I was thinking the other day when you hear people say, I wish we could go back to Bible times. I wish we could live like they lived in the Bible. That's a pretty good indication to me that they've never actually read the Bible.
Right. Right. Or no, we're like realize that lifespans were 30 years old.
Yeah.
People died. You were having babies. Everybody was getting married at 12 and 14 because they knew they were going to be dead by 30. Like, you really want to go back to mud and gowns and no science?
I think we even see this in some of this like run-of-the-mill nostalgia of like back in the day, kids just ran around till the streetlights came on, and like a lot more kids weren't okay. We don't talk about that. But also, like when I hear they want to go back to simpler times, what I hear as a survivor of this is, you want to go back to a time before labor laws protected women and children.
Right. On civil rights and, the things that made it really easy to be, especially white, straight, and male, but not just white, straight, and male. There's usually an undercurrent and a subtext that they wish was the good old days. I was one of those kids that ran pretty feral, till the streetlights came on. Gen X is a wonderful generation to look at and see what was the real outcome of all that feral childhood. Are we truly better off? I mean, I have grandchildren now, and I'm watching this generation parent babies with more technology, science, evidence, resource support than any other time in humanity. And I'm impressed. They can say things like, I want my baby to be securely attached. And I sit there like, I didn't even know what that word meant. When I was having children, we didn't have psychology. We couldn't say the word anxiety, until like 2008. So it's amazing what time and progress will offer us if we will only reach out and take it and protect it in times like these where they're trying to threaten our entire civilization.
Yeah. I remember this moment when I had just had my baby and we were, showing off the baby to family. And so sitting around the table, and it was like all the new moms and all the grandmothers. And all of the new moms were talking about what you said. I read this report, there's this thing, there's this science, this book. And all the grandmothers are saying, well, I don't know. Like in my day, Dr. So-and-so said. And it was one of those moments, I think, that it just clicked for me that like the elder isn't always the one that has the most experience,
Right. Exactly. They were experimenting, we know some of the outcomes of those practices. So I get it that Dr. Spock was an expert, but we now know how his methods turned out. So we can choose better. We have the freedom and the privilege in time to choose better. And it's maddening to me that we are talking in 2024 about basic vaccine rights and basic contraception. And I know that no fault divorce is on the table. And we've made this much progress in our lifetimes, and it's back in everyday conversation.
Tia, as you were working through the journaling in your therapy process, was there a particular story that came to your mind first that perhaps was enlightening to you, kind of showing you that, hey, I am on the right path. It was bad for me then. It's better for me now. And so I've got to keep walking in this direction. And if so, could you share that story, what that moment was like for you?
Well, the big one that I knew I had to contend with was domestic discipline and spirit wife discipline in reformed homes in the church that is still growing out in Idaho now. There's this practice in this evangelical patriarchy, which does span Presbyterian, Baptist, Pentecostal. There are a lot of people who use these pastors' materials, and they don't come out and say it overtly. There's not a great paper trail on purpose of what they teach, but it's in the communities, and there's a long list of Me Too people. And I knew that in order to really be effective in telling my story, I had to tell the whole truth, which meant I would have to tell not just about marital rape, not just about infant loss, not just about all of the domestic abuse that my church actually said was okay. I call it church sanctioned domestic abuse because we were counseled to live this way. but I had to like say the thing that was so hard for me to admit to anybody. And when that happened to me, when I lived through wife discipline, I swore to myself I would never tell anybody. It was mortifying to me that I had fallen that low, because I'm a sparky person with a lot of courage and fire, and I had allowed myself to be so broken that I would submit to something like that in order to stay safe. And I was humiliated for a very long time. And when I saw that, oh, Doug Wilson's empire is still growing out in Idaho, and you don't have to do 6 degrees of separation to get him to Washington. You have to do like 3.
Mm-hmm.
And that was years ago. He's probably 1 degree away now. I knew I got to tell the whole truth, and that's what's going to help make my memoir stand out, is that I'm pulling the curtain all the way back. So yeah, I mean, it was very important to me to tell it well. I had never written a long form book, so also a good portion of that time was learning how to write a book and how to tell it in a way that would be well written and convey the story well, so that there wasn't a distraction in the telling itself.
This is one of the things I say to my audience a lot about my process too. It was like I would write something and I would show it to people and they would be like, I don't get it. And especially when I was in the proposal and rejection process. And I remember just being like, okay, Daniella, you need to learn to tell it better.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, it's an essential thing.
And one of the things I learned, because I, of course, didn't take, well, I mean, it was a 13-year journey for me, but I was earlier in my journey than you. And I opted to go with co-writers.
Mm-hmm.
And that turned into such an interesting experience. And I just describe it as like, we all need to learn to tell our stories.
Mm-hmm.
But I would have those moments where, like you said, like it was just the embarrassing thing or thing that you thought you couldn't share with anyone. And then getting a sneak peek of like other women being like, oh no, I get this. Like, I know what you're talking about.
All of my shame melted away the first time I got my first Me Too. I said it in a caption on Instagram a couple years before I finished my book. And I got a Me Too from a pastor's wife. And I was like, okay, that's all I need to hear. I know that this is widespread because I know what was going on in my congregations. And I'm like, what's my humiliation? That's just ego, like I can get past that in order to help other women stay safe. And so it's just face it down, say the thing. I mean, you did a great job in your book too. Your book opens with a pretty visceral story that you got to get past and say the thing.
Yeah, for sure. I just want to say this as a tip for listeners, because I know a lot of you are writing, like sometimes it helps to address the hardest story first.
Yeah,
and then
absolutely.
The rest will start to kind of flow.
Tia, when you look back on your experiences, when you look at the culture, and I'm somewhat familiar growing up in a Pentecostal cult with the dynamics of what is referred to as complementarianism, the idea that men and women are different, except that they have different roles, et cetera, which is all an extension of patriarchy and control. Do you think that the group that you were associated with, and maybe evangelical culture in general in the United States, do you think that this is something that they actually believe to be true, or is it a matter of this is helpful to accomplish our means and our goals and our control, and then they develop all of the theology after the fact, right? Let's find verses that confirm what we already believe to be true or what works for us in this situation.
I love this question because it really hits on number one. If it was so natural, they wouldn't have to preach about it all the time,
right?
To their own believers that this is how you should be living. Like we would all be doing that. Clearly, all men are not the same, and all women are not the same, and we do not just have these like cookie cutter roles and cookie cutter skill sets just based on our genitalia. So I think like we get it in our instincts, and it's just a matter of how dead to your instincts you are. I think how obedient you are. I know so many families that bend all those rules at home. There are men who are washing their dishes because that's how they've divided labor in their homes.
They need to be done.
They might not admit that at church, right? They might not admit it at church that they're helping their wife with the dishes, or cooking, heaven forbid they're cooking. But they're doing it. And there are women who are absolutely the heads of their homes, and just playing that good submissive game in public. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of do as I say, not as I do in patriarchy.
I found this term recently, and it's a term for when we are like auto surveilling and then surveilling those around us and policing each other. And I think it's
Mm-hmm.
one of the best named terms ever because it's performative
Yeah,
regulation. And
exactly.
I will never forget, I was 12 years old and we were finally living in a commune that was small enough that it was just one other family, and that family went away. So for like the first time ever, my family was alone for like many days. And immediately my parents didn't care about any of our rules. And right there, I remember being like, this is BS. And we all knew that when the other family came back, we were going to have to like go back to all the rules. And I was like, I remember just looking at my dad as a 12-year-old and being like, wow, in my head, right? Like, you
Hmm.
don't even believe any of this.
It's all fake.
Tia,
Wow.
when we examine this more closely and we look at it and we know it's happening in churches and homes across the United States, um, what is the message that you want to communicate to people that are experiencing perhaps what you experienced and they have questions about it, and like Daniela said, they go on vacation and suddenly all of the rules stop. They live differently for a few weeks. They don't go to church on Sunday, and then they return to the group, and all of those rules are enforced. And maybe they're having all these questions like you did, like we all do, but really don't know what the next step should be. I know for me, growing up in my high control group, it was a matter of asking questions and keeping a lot of thoughts internally as I worked this out before I found the courage to leave.
Yeah, what to do next is also like just one of those so individual things. In my work, I'm striving to educate people so they'll recognize it in their own lives. Clearly I'm not a like guru person who can see it all. I can help you be more attuned to what's happening so that you understand when something that feels off, that you have language to call it and to know what it is. And the end goal for that is to end oppression and abuse. Like, there are abusive practices happening right underneath everyone's noses, and it's to people who don't have any consent in this lifestyle. When we talk about trad wives, we're talking about the parents, but the children are the ones that we really care about, have no say in what's happening in their homes. It's not better to raise a child like it's 1800 in 2024, and that kid won't have say until they're 18. And that's after all the damage has been done. So being able to know the signs and see what's going on around you will make you a stronger, better advocate. If it's happening to you, you might have language that helps you understand that you need to leave, that you have resources, that you're not imagining this. One of the things I rail about a lot is people saying that marriage is hard and that love is hard. Whoa, what a flaming red flag. If your marriage is hard all the time and if it hurts all the time, guess what? You're probably in some sort of abuse dynamic. So, like, it's the more we talk about it and the more we name it and describe it, the more empowered each individual is to take that and use that in their life, which will have the critical mass, to Washington. Eventually, we have our more informed voters.
Tia, could you talk about the perfectionism that is foisted not only on women, but on children? You mentioned, and I described growing up in a cult as just no spontaneous moments of joy. And I
Yeah.
think it's like because the promise of the cult that everything will be perfect is a lie. And so eventually children are going to fall under just extreme discipline, expectation for perfection. And I'm wondering if you like noticed this in your children as you
Yeah.
were in the lifestyle.
That's a great question. Because there's it's kind of a multifaceted stone to look at. Fundamentalism depends on the individual's perfection in order to achieve it. That whatever they're promising in fundamentalism is never real. And if there's failure along the way, it's always your fault. So you're always trying to be more perfect so that you can actually attain the thing that they are dangling in front of you. And the dangling carrot is a really great psychological term to go research, because they're always moving the goalposts. It's always something that's out of your reach because of sin or because of your own failing. And so you're always trying to purify towards this idea. When you put that into little children who are naturally supposed to be making mistakes and developing and growing into the people that they are, there's no grace, and there's very high stakes to make sure everybody cooperates, because if it's the parent and their children are unruly, it reflects on the parents. So suddenly this very emotional impetus to make everybody conform is there, and that's what makes parents reach for really strict discipline methods, things that they might, if they sat quietly, they might not want to hit their kid, but in the moment they have to make their kids sit still in church, because otherwise everyone's going to look at them. It's this, like, just steaming pot of, it just nurtures itself and bubbles in on itself. Like, there's no way to escape perfectionism. And I think it's one of the ways that we carry with us the most into deconstruction. I hear a lot of survivors, they're still grappling with perfectionism years after maybe they broke down the beliefs, they understand what kind of group they were in, they've made big radical changes in their life, but they're still struggling, usually with people pleasing and perfectionism.
I honestly say that I am grateful that my book did not debut on the New York Times, because it kicked me right, like, the last little bit off the perfectionism train that I needed.
Nice.
And now I can see it all, like, my
Mm-hmm.
whole life, exactly what you said, because that's the environment. And especially as a kid who was neurodivergent and always asking questions and didn't fit, you
Right.
know, it's sad, but I always say that to break people, you need isolation, pain, and small acts of kindness. And I was just
Yeah.
so different that they forgot the small acts of kindness with me. So, like, it didn't stick. Um, but then it was like I would go on to spend another almost 20 years just, like, trying so hard to fit in.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking, like, I think there's some kind of belief that you can, like, out
Mm-hmm.
perfection your trauma, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And when your belonging and your safety all depend on how well you fit in, and then you realize you don't fit in, you're in real danger, so it's very vulnerable, very scary. Um, and yeah, I'm neurodivergent as well, and like, there's just no way I could be perfect enough. I really gave it my best shot, and I'm very high capacity. I did a pretty good job of being an excellent track wife, but not at the end of the day, because it's not really attainable. No one can be that perfect.
And this brings up something that is very near and dear to my heart, which is one of the things that is a result of this is often suicide. And it's one of the
Hmm.
patterns that we see in cults, so to me, like, even when I'm studying normal organizations and I'm like, this Sappho stuff sounds crazy, and then I see a pattern of suicides and I'm like, and I think that it comes down to what you just said, like, no one can maintain that, no one can be perfect enough. And one of the really heartbreaking things I've heard from my audience is children of Mormons and evangelicals, thinking that they needed to die before they hit the age of 7 or 8, because that was their, like, age when they would start sinning.
Yeah.
Um, there wasn't really a question
Yeah,
there.
and
No.
all of that resonates with me, right? Because I mean, this was something that I experienced as a child, and certainly you did as well. But this idea that the most vulnerable in the group are the ones that are most often abused, taken advantage of. You go down the list of free labor, of all of the exploitation that the group is endeavoring to impose. It starts as a child, and that's something that you've got to deal with for the rest of your life. I know, at 53, I'm still dealing with a lot of that baggage that I received early on, because it's your identity, it's your purpose, your origin, your meaning, morality, destiny. All of it is tied up in that particular group, in that particular dogma, and I think that's exactly right. That the most vulnerable often receive the brunt of all of that abuse.
Yeah, I mean, churches and cults and in general, they need you young. They need the zeal of the young people to keep perpetuating. And then you do have these this age bracket. I'm sure you've seen this in your research, Daniela, with people in their 20s and 30s. They're falling away because they're starting, their critical thinking and their cognitive brain development. Everything is online, and they're no longer as malleable and formable as they were as children. And so maybe they come back, later, but it's constantly renewing in the youth cycle. And they got to have those babies young. So, then you got to get rid of birth control. You got to have people having lots of families, lots of babies. It's interesting to me that we're seeing the birther movement, which is not necessarily religious, at the same time as the quiverful movement. They're piggybacking one another very seamlessly. But what it's going to result in is a crap ton of kids coming out with abuse stories in about 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. On the flip side, when they fail to keep the children, this is how the cults end. And I do think, like, obviously we are in the other side of the pendulum swing, right? Like, we had some freedoms, we had some progress, and now we're going back. But, like, I don't know. Do you take any hope from this election that, like, youth are leaving religion in broad numbers?
I think that's very complicated. Gen Z is radicalized, and they have too much pressure on them to save the world. Everyone thought that they were going to carry the election. What an unfair burden for everybody to put on young kids that were handed a crap hand with COVID and the rest of their education. A lot of them launched out of high school into loneliness and really hard times, and our academic system's a mess. And so I don't know where the young people are going. They're coming into chaos, and fundamentalism thrives in chaos. So I am tender with them. I don't want to put that pressure on them. I think adults should not abdicate our role in making sure that they have a thriving society. And hope from this election, I mean, my hope with this election is that chaos also can just fall in on itself. And when you give these narcissists enough rope, they take care of it themselves. And so we are seeing some self-destructive behavior from that sector. And when I see it, I'm like, may it be. Just wear yourselves out, because the grown-ups shall reign again, is what I hope.
I think there's no chance that Elon and Trump will be speaking by this holiday, like, I'm just like, I think it's so funny because he's playing by the cult leader playbook, right? And those of us who've lived under this, like, all three of us, like, we recognized it right in the beginning. But he's also making all the same mistakes.
He sure is. And he's
and
old. Trump's old.
These people build their cults, and then they just surround themselves with, like, fellow narcissists who affirmed their rise to power. But the problem is, I tell people this a lot with cults, right? It can go one of two ways. You either put effective bureaucrats in and they start routinizing and writing things down and making rules, which makes it harder for the charismatic leader to do whatever he wants. Or you put in a bunch of fellow narcissists, and then you're fighting your own lieutenants the whole time. And that's usually what happens. Like, we can see it in Jim, we can see it in all of them. And I just kind of think it's too funny. I mean, down to underestimating the women.
Right.
One of my favorite.
At their own peril. They really are doing that at their own peril.
Oh my goodness. It's the amount of majority men online every day who tell me to go get military experience before I criticize the military. I'm like, oh, y'all are not going to be hard to beat. And like, knitting's Morse code. Like, we're going to have just like a brigade of women. But I mean, I think that's also what's kind of funny right now, is that, like, these men truly seem to believe that we women who have experienced freedom and somewhat of equality are just going to kind of like go quietly into the night.
Right.
Do you have, do you have any predictions?
It's pretty haunting to look at pictures from Iran and other countries that have put their women back in boxes. Yeah, exactly. It's terrifying. And it does give me like a dose of sobriety of like, oh, yeah, if it's horrible enough and lasts long enough and organized enough, it can happen. However, it doesn't have the signs of being organized enough. The Christian patriarch isn't the majority. They don't have that much of a control. They have a crazy madman at their helm. I mean, who knows how long he's going to live, but then they are infighting so much. Elon is going to get caught with all of his interference that is starting to break. So, I just think we need to stay the course as trauma survivors and keep our wits about us, keep our courage, keep our network going, doing the things that are ultimately hold a society together and help
Yeah.
one another.
It is.
And we also have insights on how to survive this, right? Because we have been under authoritarian rule before.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah.
amazing in the lead up to this election how much of the language from the Republican ticket mirrored the language that we all heard growing up within our particular groups when it comes to the patriarchy, to complementarianism, the roles of men and women. I mean, J.D. Vance criticizing childless cat ladies, the fact that that he says we've got to start having babies. All of this is very similar to what you would hear in other fundamentalism as well. Whether it's Islam or other high control religious groups. But going forward, I wonder, with every movement, with every group that sort of exerts itself in power, there's always a backlash to that power.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering what it will look like on the other side of this. And I think both of you are doing yeoman's work when it comes to writing and to speaking out and things of that nature.
Yeah, I think we can again probably take some wisdom from the family to larger scale model that they're using for their control. We can look at that for whatever breaks their control. Women have so much power to escape, to subvert, to teach their children differently, to raise the next generation, to network and connect. There are so many good men involved, like yourself included. Yes, you look like that, but you're not a patriarch that's looking to oppress women. There are a lot of men like that out there, good men who care to not see us go backwards in time. And I put a lot of stock in that having the ultimate sway in the future. I don't think you go backwards quite so easily. It would take so much to make that happen. I'm very concerned with the family unit and what's happening in homes and how that, accumulates to a mass. But I think we see a lot of movement when we just tell our stories. Every single time one of us tells our stories and someone else says me too, or they feel the space and the courage to do it alongside, that's the air, that's oxygen, the patriarchy didn't get, and who knows where it leads. So I have an optimism for the future. It's very stubborn optimism, but I can't shake it.
I agree. And I keep telling people this about the military as well, that like the military and the government, yes, they are these machines and yes, they can do bad stuff, but like they are filled with people, right? Like American citizens are not going to turn on the population, right? Like the military, I really don't think the first person to try to test, peaceful transfer of power is going to be successful in America.
And our Constitution. Our military is sworn to protect the Constitution, and every military person I've talked to takes that very seriously. And if I'm to believe that small sample, I can have some faith in that checks and balance. Also, I love what's happening online right now. Conversations, the power of the people has changed cabinet appointees. We have gotten bots down. There are things that we do in our national conversation that can be downplayed because of just social media chatter, but not actually. We are power. The people are the checks and balance that's left. We don't have a great court. We don't have a great Congress. We don't know about our elections, but we do have voices still.
Yeah. And I keep saying this analogy of like the frogs in the pot that gets used so much in like cults and extremism. But it's like, but if the frogs wake up, and I think we are, right, and jump out of the pot, now you have 340 million frogs jumping around your kitchen. Like they're not going to be getting anything done.
Sounds a little bit like that plague in Egypt.
Well, and as long, given some things that he said today, if he's distracted with the Panama Canal and changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of
Yeah.
America, if he focuses on those things, maybe
Yeah.
we'll be okay.
He's Don Quixote to me. I
Yeah.
mean, he's out there with his windmills and he's and I think the powers that be must be so frustrated with him because he has very skilled attorneys and sharp people behind him that uh, have to put him out there for population, the popular vote. But um, I'm sure there's a lot of people tearing their hair out every time he opens his mouth.
Yeah, and that gives
Yeah.
me hope, when I see the incompetence and the lack
Mm,
of organization, because I know, how massive an undertaking it would be to actually move us backwards as a nation.
yeah, their chaos will kill time. That's what we saw in the last time
Mhm.
in 2020. It was unfortunate that we had the pandemic in the middle of all of that, and there are consequences to having chaos and in control. But they didn't get a lot done, and they didn't get a lot done. Like there's two ways to look at that. So, um, if the
Yeah.
Constitution holds, um, we're okay.
That's
The response to your book has been fantastic from what I can see, and I look forward to reading it. What are some of the stories that you're hearing from people that have read your book that you find encouraging?
I love when people a lot of the reviews are mentioning how much they can relate to it, even though they had a very different experience themselves, certainly not as extreme, as harrowing. They were on the same path and they could see where it would have led if they hadn't made a few different changes. A lot of people are feeling like I put language to the things that they didn't know how to name. I love when they send in their lines and their favorite, the way they resonate with it. But I'm also surprised at how many people read it, like turn around and read it a second time as soon as they finish it. Like they needed to know I was okay. And I'm like, if you're holding the memoir of somebody who's been through hard stuff, they come out okay because they were able to write it. It's obviously a triumphant thing. Um, and I just also love that people are able I made that decision to include the mainstream in my story, and people are seeing that. They're in their day-to-day lives and they're starting to recognize this phenomena and share it with their friends, and the conversations are happening, and I'm very excited to see where that leads.
And this is so interesting with cult studies because basically in the 70s, when all the big cults were popping up in our last huge time of social turmoil, the people were making progress on getting some laws passed that were going to be about coercive control. And this is when mainstream religious leaders decided they were going to fight that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Decided that any kind of control impinged on their control, and thus began the cult wars in the 80s and 90s were basically dominated by this don't say the word cult, don't listen to cult survivors. They're all disgruntled. And it's like, it's the same thing you experience, I'm sure, but it's like people being like, don't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to harm survivors. I don't know if you get any of that, but
I
my
get
response
a
is
lot of,
always just nobody that doesn't want you to use the word cult, like, has your
right?
best interest in mind or that doesn't want you to share your story.
I get a ton of not all Christians and people who are very protective of their faith system, and they don't like it if I've left faith, and they want to know that God is still good. And I'm spiritually private. I don't talk about my personal faith beliefs anymore because I believe that personal autonomy and privacy is something I should have had in the beginning. Young children should find out who they are before they find out what they believe. And as an indoctrinated child, I was not given that. So I'm very private about my personal beliefs now. But it's interesting to me when people are like, but do you still believe in God? I need to know that you still believe in God. You don't need to know anything about my private beliefs. You need to know about your private beliefs. You and God is all you have to square with, and that's on you, and it doesn't have anything to do with me. Um, it's clear, not all Christians. This is not all Christian churches are cults. Um, but the people who are very interested in protecting the reputation of Christianity need to take some hard looks at the way they're living because they have just prioritized the system over the people and the survivors who have experienced cults. And that's where I put my effort. I don't have endless energy to cheerlead the people that are doing it right. I'm here for the people that got harmed, and I'm interested in stemming that harm and not allowing it to continue and just harm others. So, yeah, sorry, not sorry. Like,
Yeah, and it's interesting that the response from these groups, it's so predictable. I think we could all tell our story about leaving and how you go through these phases, right? First of all, if you're going to leave, just shut up about it, leave, and you're all of a sudden you're persona non grata. It's as if you never lived. And then, then the second wave is, well, you're bitter, you're disgruntled.
yeah,
And so I get a lot of that, right? That, well, you had a bad experience, and so that bad experience is clouding all of your critiques of this particular movement or group.
it's interesting you mentioned bitterness, because my third book is kind of centers on the theme is bitterness as an empowerment tool of empowerment,
Right.
because it's used to shame people into silence. And I really believe bitterness forms when there's been an injustice and you didn't have a chance to. There's no antidote. There's no way for you to remedy it, and so they call you bitter, and so that you'll be quiet and just keep things going, push it under the rug, when you're supposed to be smiling sweetly and not holding people accountable. But bitterness is actually medicine. That is how we heal, is by allowing the bitter to work. And so I think that if we free our freedom, like allow ourselves to be bitter, there's a reason. If we're bitter, if bitterness is something, resentment is something we're holding on to, it's better to unpack why and what's underneath that than it is to shame the emotion itself so that it can be swept away.
Yeah, well said. I often in those situations, since they gave me so many Bible stories to read and to memorize as a child, and since I did that so well, I often remind them of the story of Ruth and Orpah in the Old Testament, where she said, or Naomi, she says, God has made me bitter. Well, there you go, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is
Yep.
times when our bitterness is a tool to make us better and to move forward, and to simply label someone. It's a thought stopping cliche to say that someone is bitter
That's right.
or that someone is disgruntled or someone is hurt without taking into account what they have experienced. And most of these groups are unwilling to even acknowledge that anything has happened that is wrong. And so until you get to that point, it's very difficult to have a conversation of any legitimacy.
Yeah. Yeah, because that would make them have to change. Nobody wants change.
Yeah.
They don't. It's other people. That's not how we do things here. Yeah, I know all the lines, and I was made to be vocal. I can't. It's the way I am.
Yeah, there's something I've heard you say before about how, like, one of your mantras or one of the things you believe in is to never put ideas before people.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's my simple layman's term for fundamentalism, how to recognize it. I wanted a really quick filter to know if I was dealing with something that was human and loving and life-giving, or if it was in service to a system. And so I want to put people before ideas, always, no matter what. I don't ever want to value an ideology over somebody else's humanity. And that's what fundamentalism is. The ideological purity is the thing that matters most, and everyone else is supposed to subject themselves in service to it, and it breaks people. So that little quick mantra of people before ideas is always my litmus if I'm confronted with a system or a group that is, we're surrounded by group thinks and opportunities to join groups all of the time. We're also confronted with social pressure and issues that come up in our headlines. And if something comes up that's controversial and I don't fully understand it, I know where my default needs to lie in is whatever is most compassionate to a human being. It is not necessary for me to understand the full science of it or the strategy behind it or anything. I don't need to have the full understanding to know where my priority needs to be. And so that helps me with my day to day, just loving other people and showing up for them in a protective way, and being an advocate and an ally. That's where I'm going to live. I've tried it the other way, and like I said, it broke people, it broke relationships, it ends in death for a lot of people, and that's not what I'm called to do.
And Tia is so good at what she does, y'all. I'm one of those people that read the book and then read it again and then listened to the audio And I mean, your book for me, Tia, goes up in my like top 5 or whatever books that I think I literally cannot oversell enough, along with Isabel Wilkerson's Cast, which is like my
You
holy
read
grail
so
of
much.
book.
That's high praise, and I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, and I think I told you, I think I'll read it every 5 years because I'll be at like a different place in my deconstruction. I'm so honored to know you. You're such a great, also just like literary citizen and teacher and instructor. And I'm hoping you can tell everyone like where to find you, how to work with you.
Oh yeah, that's all
etc.
easy. I'm Tia Levings writer on all the social platforms. My website's tialevings.com, and my Substack, where I deconstruct fundamentalism in our headlines, news, families, all of that, is tialevings.substack.com. You can buy my book anywhere.
Absolutely. Tia, thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to maybe having you back in the future to continue this conversation. What you're doing is important work, and we appreciate it very, very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
And for all of our listeners and viewers, do us a favor and hit that like button, share and subscribe, and follow Daniella on social media, buy her book, Uncultured, and keep up with everything that we're doing here at Cults and the Culting of America podcast. For Daniella Mestenek Young, I'm Scot Loyd. We'll see you on the next episode.